The rain pounded against the windshield as Sawyer Callahan gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, his knuckles white with tension. He glanced at the rearview mirror, checking the backseat where his 5-year-old daughter, Felicity, was fast asleep, her tiny face peaceful despite the storm outside. His stomach twisted with guilt. He had promised her pancakes for dinner, but the last of his cash had gone to gas so he could keep driving for rideshare fares. A flash of movement caught his eye. A woman stood on the curb, struggling to shield herself from the downpour. Her dark hair clung to her face, her business suit soaked through. She looked desperate. Sawyer pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a ride?" The woman hesitated for only a second before yanking open the door and sliding in. She was shivering, her fingers trembling as she buckled herself in. "Yes, thank you. I've been trying to hail a cab for 20 minutes. Her voice was smooth but laced with exhaustion. "Rough night?" Sawyer asked, pulling back onto the road. "You could say that," she murmured, rubbing her arms for warmth. He turned up the heat. "Where to?" She let out a slow breath, as if deciding whether to trust him. "Westwood Towers." Sawyer arched a brow. That was one of the most expensive high-rises in the city. Whoever she was, she clearly had money. Not that it was any of his business. "I'm Sawyer, by the way," he said, keeping his focus on the road. "Whitney Monroe." "Nice to meet you, Whitney." She glanced into the backseat, her expression softening when she saw Felicity. "Your daughter." "Yeah," he said, his voice lowering. "Felicity, she's my whole world." Whitney smiled faintly. "She looks peaceful." Sawyer chuckled. "She trusts me to keep her safe. It's a big responsibility." Something about the way he said it made Whitney's chest tighten. There was a quiet strength in his words, an unwavering devotion that struck her harder than she expected. They drove in silence for a few moments before she spoke again. "You do rideshare full-time?" "Yeah, pays the bills mostly." There was something in his tone that made Whitney glance at him again. His jaw was tight, his eyes focused. This wasn't a man coasting through life without ambition. He was fighting for something. When they pulled up to Westwood Towers, Whitney hesitated before reaching for the door handle. She had been prepared to step into an empty penthouse, to drown herself in work and forget the disaster of her evening. But something about Sawyer, about the way he had treated her without knowing who she was, made her pause. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching for her bag. Sawyer shook his head. "Don't worry about it." Her brows furrowed. "But—" "It's just a ride," he said simply. "You looked like you needed one." Whitney stared at him. In her world, everything had a price. No one did anything for free. And yet, here was a man giving her kindness without expecting anything in return. Before she could think better of it, she pulled out a business card and handed it to him. "If you ever need anything, call me." Sawyer glanced at the card but made no move to take it. "I appreciate that, but I'm not looking for handouts." "It's not a handout," she said softly. "Just a thank you." He hesitated, then took it, slipping it into his pocket. "Take care, Whitney." She stepped out of the car, but as she watched him drive away, something in her chest shifted. She had come across countless men in her line of work powerful, ambitious, ruthless, but none of them had ever looked at her the way Sawyer had. Like she was just a person in need of help. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered what it would be like to be seen that way again. Sawyer pulled into his driveway, the worn tires of his sedan crunching over the gravel. The house was small, barely more than a cottage, but it was home. Felicity stirred in the back seat, rubbing her eyes as she woke. "We home, Daddy," she murmured sleepily. "Yeah, sweetheart, let's get you inside." He lifted her into his arms, carrying her through the front door. Inside, the air was warm, but carried the faint scent of old wood and the lingering aroma of the grilled cheese sandwiches he'd made for lunch. He set Felicity down on the couch, tucking a blanket around her as she yawned. "Did you get your pancakes?" she mumbled, her tiny voice laced with drowsiness. Sawyer's heart clenched. "Not tonight, baby, but I'll make you the biggest stack ever this weekend. Promise." She nodded, already drifting back to sleep. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead, then stood with a sigh. His body ached from hours behind the wheel, but there was still work to do. Rent was due in a week, and his savings were almost gone. Pulling the business card from his pocket, he turned it over between his fingers. Whitney Monroe. He had no idea what she did, but people who lived in Westwood Towers weren't exactly struggling to make ends meet. He considered tossing the card into the junk drawer, but something stopped him. Instead, he placed it carefully on the counter and moved to the small desk in the corner of the room. Opening his laptop, he pulled up a job search site. He needed something steadier than rideshare fares, something that would give Felicity more than just barely getting by. As he scrolled through listings, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello." A smooth, familiar voice responded. "Sawyer, it's Whitney." His brows lifted. "Did I leave something in the car?" "No, just wanted to thank you again for the ride." He leaned against the counter, surprised at the call. "You already did." "Well, I'm thanking you again," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "I was wondering if you'd let me return the favor." Sawyer frowned. "What do you mean?" "I run a company," she said, her voice careful, as if she was trying to gauge his reaction. "And we have an opening for a driver. It's a good salary, benefits included." His grip on the phone tightened. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for charity." "It's not charity, it's a job." He exhaled slowly. "You don't even know if I'm qualified." "I think I have a pretty good sense of people," she countered. "And from what I saw tonight, you're responsible, careful, and you drive well. That's all I need." Sawyer glanced across the room at Felicity, her small figure curled beneath the blanket. A real salary, stability, health insurance. But accepting help, even in the form of a job, didn't sit easily with him. "Just think about it," Whitney said before he could decline outright. "I'll have my assistant send the details. If you're interested, come by tomorrow." He was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, "All right, I'll think about it." "Good, I hope to see you." When the call ended, Sawyer stared at the phone in his hand. He wasn't sure what to make of Whitney Monroe. She had the kind of confidence that came from living in a world he'd never known, yet she hadn't looked down at him. If anything, she'd looked at him like he was worth something. He set the phone down and ran a hand through his hair. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break he needed. The next morning, Sawyer stood outside a glass skyscraper, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He adjusted the cuffs of his only dress shirt, then stepped inside. The lobby was sleek, expansive, with high ceilings and a polished marble floor. A receptionist greeted him, directing him to the top floor. When the elevator doors slid open, Whitney was waiting. She looked different in the daylight, more composed but no less striking. "You came," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. "I figured it couldn't hurt to hear the details," he replied evenly. She nodded, leading him down a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. "The position is straightforward. You'd be my personal driver. Transport me to meetings, events, business trips. Full salary, benefits for you and your daughter." Sawyer stiffened. "How do you know about Felicity?" Whitney met his gaze without hesitation. "You mentioned her last night. I did some checking. I like to know who I'm hiring." He folded his arms. "And what exactly do you get out of this?" Her expression softened. "A reliable driver, and maybe someone who reminds me that not everyone in this world is looking for an angle." Something in her voice made him pause. There was honesty there, a quiet vulnerability she wasn't used to showing. After a long moment, he said, I'll take the job. Whitney's smile widened just slightly. Good, you start Monday. As he walked out of the building, something unexpected settled in his chest. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a distant dream. Sawyer adjusted the cuffs of his dark jacket as he pulled the sleek black sedan in front of the high-rise entrance. He had been driving for Whitney Monroe for 2 weeks now, and every day felt like a strange shift into a world he wasn't entirely sure he belonged in. The car itself was a machine of precision, a far cry from the aging sedan he still used for personal errands. The leather seats, the smooth hum of the engine, it was luxury wrapped in efficiency. He watched as Whitney stepped out of the building, her heels clicking against the pavement with practiced confidence. She was dressed in a crisp navy outfit today, her dark hair pulled back in a way that made her look even more poised than usual. She slid into the back seat, her perfume filling the air with something soft and expensive. "Morning," she said, her voice composed, but there was something lighter in it than there had been when they first met. "Morning," he replied, glancing at her through the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. He had never worked a job like this before, one where professionalism meant keeping conversation to a minimum, yet the air between them didn't always feel strictly business. Whitney exhaled as she glanced down at her phone. It's going to be one of those days. One of those days where everything goes wrong, or one where you have to deal with people who make you want to throw your phone out the window. "The second one," she admitted, rubbing her temple lightly. Sawyer chuckled under his breath. "Well, if it helps, I promise not to be one of those people." She looked up from her phone, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "I appreciate that." The city passed by in a blur of towering buildings and morning traffic. He had come to learn the rhythm of her schedule, the morning meetings, the working lunches, the rare moments of quiet she found in between. He didn't ask questions about her business dealings, though he could tell they weren't the kind of meetings where people exchanged pleasantries over coffee. As he pulled up to the glass building where her next meeting was scheduled, Whitney hesitated before stepping out. "It might be a while." "Take your time," he said. She nodded, but before she could leave, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. Whatever was on the other end of that call wasn't good news. Sawyer didn't linger, but as she walked into the building, he noted the way her shoulders squared like she was preparing for battle. He waited in the car, listening to the gentle hum of the city around him. Every now and then, his thoughts drifted to Felicity. She had adjusted quickly to the change in their routine, though she still asked if he would be home in time to read to her before bed. He had made sure the answer was always yes. After nearly an hour, Whitney returned, her movements sharper than before. She slid into the back seat and shut the door with more force than necessary. "Everything okay?" he asked, pulling away from the curb. She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You ever work with people who think they're entitled to everything just because they have money?" Sawyer glanced at her through the mirror, arching a brow. "You mean besides you?" For a second, she looked genuinely startled, then a laugh escaped her. A real one. "Fair point." She leaned back against the seat, exhaling. "But no, I mean people who don't just have money, they think the world owes them something because of it. I built my company from the ground up, but there are people sitting at my table who think their last name is enough to make them untouchable." Sawyer made a slow turn down the avenue. "Sounds exhausting." "It is." She rested her elbow against the door, watching the passing streets. "But it's the price of success, right? You fight your way to the top, and then you spend every day proving you deserve to be there." He considered that for a moment. "I think success should mean you don't have to fight so hard anymore." She tilted her head slightly, as if the thought had never occurred to her. "Maybe, but I don't think I know how to stop fighting." There was something in the way she said it, something that made Sawyer realize just how much weight she carried. He had always assumed people in her position had it easy, that wealth and power made life smoother. But looking at her now, he wasn't so sure. They rode in silence for a few moments before she spoke again. "What about you? What do you want?" He tightened his grip on the wheel. "I want Felicity to have more than I ever did growing up. I don't need much for myself, just enough to make sure she never has to worry." Whitney studied him for a long beat. "You really love her?" "More than anything," he said without hesitation. She looked away, something unreadable in her expression. "That's rare." Sawyer didn't know what to say to that. Instead, he focused on the road, letting the quiet settle between them. When they reached her next location, he pulled up to the curb. She didn't move to get out right away. Instead, she turned to him, her gaze intent. "Would you ever consider doing something more than driving?" He frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because think you're capable of a lot more than you give yourself credit for." Sawyer let out a short breath. "Driving pays the bills." "It does," she acknowledged, "but that doesn't mean it's all you're meant for." He didn't respond right away, and she didn't push. Instead, she gave him one last glance before stepping out of the car, disappearing into the building. Sawyer sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. He had spent so much time surviving, he hadn't stopped to think about what came after. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if just getting by was enough anymore. Sawyer adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket, a far cry from the worn flannel shirts he used to wear daily. The past few months had changed everything. He wasn't just Whitney Monroe's driver anymore. She had seen something in him, something he had long buried beneath the weight of responsibility. And now, he was managing key logistics for her company, ensuring efficiency in operations, a job he had never imagined himself doing, yet one he had grown into seamlessly. More than that, he had grown closer to Whitney in ways neither of them had planned. Tonight, the skyline shimmered against the evening lights as he stepped onto the rooftop terrace of the exclusive event space Whitney had rented for an investor gathering. The air carried the scent of fresh roses and fine champagne, the sound of quiet conversation mixing with the soft notes of a live string quartet. And then he saw her. Whitney stood near the edge of the terrace, speaking with a group of executives, but her attention flickered toward him the moment he arrived. She was radiant elegance woven into every movement, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes told a different story. A story only he knew. She excused herself and made her way toward him, the heels of her shoes tapping lightly against the stone floor. "You clean up well," she noted, tilting her head as she took in his appearance. "Figured I should at least try to match the company at Keep," he said, his tone easy yet laced with something deeper. Her lips curved slightly. "You're doing more than matching it." A server passed with a tray of champagne, but neither of them reached for a glass. Instead, Whitney's gaze searched his, as if there was something she wanted to say but hadn't found the words for yet. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted after a moment. "You asked me to be here," he said simply. "That's enough." Something flickered across her face, something vulnerable, something unspoken. Before she could respond, an older man approached, his presence commanding. "Whitney, I've been meaning to pull you aside." His sharp gaze flicked to Sawyer, assessing. "And you must be Callahan. I've heard quite a bit about you." Sawyer extended his hand, firm but measured. "Good things, I hope." The man chuckled. "Let's just say you've made an impression." Whitney exhaled lightly. "Sawyer has been an asset to the company." The man nodded, but there was something knowing in his expression. "That much is clear." He glanced between them, then with a satisfied hum, excused himself. As soon as he was gone, Whitney sighed. "That was subtle." Sawyer gave a low chuckle. "I'm guessing he's not the first person to notice." She met his gaze, something unreadable in her own. People always notice things when they don't understand them. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "And what don't they understand?" Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't move away. that maybe some things aren't about business. His fingers twitched at his side, resisting the urge to close the space between them completely. Then, what are they about? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached forward, adjusting the lapel of his jacket, a simple gesture, yet the air between them shifted entirely. "I think we both know," she murmured. Sawyer's jaw tensed, his restraint thinning. "Whitney." "Miss Monroe," a voice interrupted, snapping them both from the moment. Whitney turned, her composure slipping back into place as one of her assistants approached with an apologetic look. "You're needed for a final discussion before the presentations." She nodded, then glanced back at Sawyer. "Stay." His answer was immediate. "Always." She lingered for half a beat longer before stepping away, disappearing into the crowd. Sawyer exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had spent so long keeping his distance, ensuring that whatever existed between them stayed within the bounds of professionalism. But tonight had shattered that illusion entirely. This wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just admiration. It was something far more dangerous. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight it anymore. Hours later, after the event had concluded and the last of the guests had departed, Sawyer found himself standing beside Whitney on the terrace once again. The city stretched out before them, lights flickering like scattered stars. She sighed, rolling her shoulders slightly. "I think that went well." "You convinced a room full of investors they'd be fools not to trust you," he said, watching her carefully. "I'd call that a success." She let out a quiet laugh, but it faded quickly. "You were right, you know." "About what?" She turned to face him fully. "That success shouldn't mean fighting every day just to prove you deserve it." His chest tightened. What changed? Her expression softened. "You." Sawyer swallowed hard. "Whitney." "No more excuses," she interrupted, shaking her head. "No more pretending this isn't happening." He exhaled sharply. "You know what this means if we—" "I don't care," she said firmly. "I'm tired of caring about the rules people expect me to follow." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then finally, Sawyer moved. He reached for her, his hands framing her face as he kissed her deeply, desperately, as if the months of restraint had built to this inevitable moment. She melted into him, her fingers gripping his jacket tightly as if letting go wasn't an option. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingled in the cool night air. Whitney's eyes searched his. "So what happens now?" Sawyer brushed a thumb over her cheek, memorizing the way she looked in this moment, free, unguarded. "Whatever we want." And for the first time in years, that didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt like the beginning of something real. Sawyer stood in the doorway of his small home, watching as Felicity twirled around the living room, her laughter filling the space. The past few months had been a whirlwind, a shift from barely making ends meet to standing beside one of the most powerful women in the city. And now, here she was, sitting on his worn-out couch, her polished presence so out of place in his modest home, yet somehow, she belonged here more than anywhere else. Whitney leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees as she watched Felicity with a rare softness in her eyes. "She has your spirit," she said, glancing up at Sawyer. He folded his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "She's got more fight in her than I ever did." "You say that like you haven't been fighting your whole life." Sawyer exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Survival's different from fighting." Whitney tilted her head slightly. "Then, what do you call what you've built for her?" He didn't have an answer for that, not one that wouldn't expose how much he had been running on sheer instinct, doing whatever it took to make sure Felicity never felt the weight of the world the way he had. Felicity suddenly stopped spinning and ran over to Whitney, her small hands tugging at the sleeve of Whitney's blouse. "Do you want to see my drawings?" Whitney smiled and nodded. I'd love to. The little girl darted off, returning moments later with a stack of crayon-covered papers. She plopped down beside Whitney, flipping through them excitedly. This one's a castle, and this one is a rocket ship. And this, she paused, holding up a picture of 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, and one small. This is me and Daddy, and you. Whitney's breath hitched, just for a second. She traced a finger over the drawing, her expression unreadable. You put me in your family picture. Felicity nodded, beaming. You make Daddy happy. Sawyer's throat tightened. He met Whitney's gaze, but neither of them spoke. There was something fragile in the air, something neither of them wanted to shatter too soon. Before the moment could stretch too long, Felicity yawned, rubbing her eyes. Time for bed, kiddo, Sawyer said quietly. Felicity pouted but didn't argue, standing and stretching her arms toward him. He scooped her up effortlessly, pressing a kiss to her forehead before carrying her to her room. When he returned to the living room, Whitney was still sitting on the couch, flipping absently through Felicity's drawings. She adores you, he said, sitting beside her but keeping a slight distance. Whitney exhaled through her nose. I wasn't expecting that. Sawyer watched her carefully. That bother you? No, she said immediately. Then softer, it scares me. He tilted his head. Why? She set the drawings down, folding her hands in her lap. Because I don't do this, Sawyer. I don't let people in. I don't get attached. You think I do? He asked, his voice quiet but steady. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I think you've spent your whole life putting everyone else first. Sawyer didn't deny it. Instead, he reached forward, taking her hands in his. So what happens now? Whitney looked down at their intertwined fingers, as if the answer was written there. I don't want to walk away from this. Then don't. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to argue, but for once she didn't. Instead, she leaned in, resting her forehead against his shoulder. Sawyer pressed a kiss to the top of her head, closing his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't fighting to survive. He was finally living. And this woman, this life was worth every battle that had led him here. Sawyer stood on the balcony of Whitney's penthouse, the city stretching out before him in a sea of glittering lights. The air was cool, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic, but his thoughts were elsewhere on the woman standing behind him, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Whitney stepped closer, her heels silent against the smooth flooring. You're quiet tonight. He turned, resting his hands on the railing, just thinking. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. About what? Sawyer considered his words before speaking. About how much has changed. A year ago, I was driving through storms, trying to make enough to keep Felicity's world from crumbling. Now, I'm standing here, in this life I never expected. Whitney's expression softened. Do you regret it? He shook his head immediately, not for a second. A flicker of relief crossed her face before she glanced toward the skyline. You've built something here, Sawyer, not just for yourself, but for Felicity, for us. The word lingered between them, heavier than anything else she'd said. Us. It was something unspoken that had been growing between them for months, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way neither of them could ignore. Sawyer took a step forward, closing the space between them. And what does that mean to you? Whitney exhaled slowly. It means I don't want to spend another day pretending could ever go back to how things were before you. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative but deliberate. Then don't. She looked up at him, her gaze steady. I won't. The admission settled between them, sealing something neither of them had been willing to say outright before. Whitney reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Come with me. Sawyer followed her inside, past the sleek furniture and towering windows until they reached the dining table. A single envelope rested there, its presence deliberate. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands before offering it to him. He took it cautiously, breaking the seal. His eyes scanned the contents, his pulse steadying as he processed what he was holding. A deed. His name was on it. His throat tightened. What is this? Security, Whitney said softly. For you, for Felicity. I bought the house outright. It's yours now, no more rent, no more worrying about whether you'll have a place to call home. Sawyer swallowed hard, his grip on the paper tightening. Whitney, You don't have to accept it, she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. But I want you to, because you've given me something I never knew I needed, and this is my way of making sure you never have to struggle again. He set the deed down carefully, then reached for her, cupping her face in his hands. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to, she said simply. Sawyer exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You keep surprising me. A small smile played at her lips. Good, I plan to keep doing that. He kissed her then, slow and deep, pouring every unspoken word into it. She melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt as if she were anchoring herself to this moment. When they pulled apart, Sawyer rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. Whitney stilled, her breath catching. What? Marry me, he repeated, his voice steadier this time. Not because of the house, not because of anything else, just because I love you and I don't want to spend another day pretending I don't. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to find any hint of hesitation. When she found none, she let out a breathless laugh. You really don't do things the conventional way, do you? He grinned, never have. She pressed her hands against his chest, her heartbeat racing against his. Yes. Sawyer's chest tightened. Yes. Yes, she repeated, laughing as she kissed him again. Felicity's small voice suddenly interrupted them from the hallway. What's happening? They turned to see her standing there, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Sawyer crouched down, holding out his arms. Come here, sweetheart. She padded over, climbing into his arms. Why is Whitney smiling so much? Because, Sawyer said, glancing up at Whitney, we're going to be a family. Felicity's eyes widened. Really? Whitney nodded, crouching beside them. Really? Felicity squealed, wrapping her arms around both of them. That's the best thing ever. Sawyer met Whitney's gaze over their daughter's head, and in that moment, he knew this was the life he had fought for. This was everything. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He was home,